Hello everyone, Justin McGill. I'm doing this video today because I keep hearing the term rule of law thrown about and not in a very proper way. So I want to talk today about rule of law, what that means, what just laws are, and how this should be viewed by the citizens of the state or citizens of the country. So rule of law means that every law that's enacted applies to every individual, regardless of whether they're in government, whether they're a citizen, non-citizen. The laws are the final say in what is right and what is wrong. The foundation for our rule of law here in the United States is our constitutions. So we have the United States Constitution, which is the basis of the rule of law for any authority given under it for nationwide rule. Then we have state constitutions, which are the rule of law for everyone in those states. It's important to understand the basis of our rule of law. We see in the Declaration of Independence, the purpose of government is to protect every individual's right to life, liberty, and to personal property. So in order to have just rules, just laws, they have to be based on the protection of each individual's right to life, liberty, and private property. So anytime those laws violate somebody's right to liberty or to personal property or to take somebody's life without due process, they are not upholding the purpose of the laws. They are violating exactly what the laws are supposed to protect us from. So we see it move from being a just law to being a tyrannical law. So we need to understand rule of law is important because it doesn't allow the government officials to exempt themselves. It doesn't allow government officials to pick and choose who to apply the law against. But it's also important to understand what is a just law and what isn't. So when we have unconstitutional laws, they are laws that do not protect due process, and they allow government or individuals to violate other individuals' right to life, liberty, or to private property. So we have a particular government that is set up in the United States that is intended to provide checks against anyone intending to violate the rule of law or to violate natural law, the rights that we have naturally, in order to oppress somebody in some manner. So we have a system of government that's put in place that's different than other governments to some extent. So we based it a lot on the English government. They had an executive and the king. They had a two-bodied parliament, and then they had the judicial system. So we have an executive, but unlike the king in England, the executive is not allowed to make laws in the United States. The only persons who are allowed to make laws are the legislative body. We see that at the very beginning of the U.S. Constitution. We see that in the state constitutions. So number one, we can't have rule of law if somebody other than the lawmakers, the legislature, is giving out those laws. The colonies struggled with that a lot leading up to the Revolution because the king claimed he was a deity in a sense. So he not only could make any law that he wanted to, he was morally right in any law that he made. He was a god, or he was the voice of God. We clearly rejected that in the United States. The president not only does not get to make law, but the president is not considered a deity or hearing the voice of God. He is considered an individual like the rest of us, with the same flaws, the same penchant towards abuse of others. So we first off recognized that flaw in all of humanity, and we secondly created the position in such a manner that it had no ability to run amok without the consent of the governed. So the check on the president running amok would be impeachments. So our legislature could get together and impeach him and remove him. Or if he violated a law such as a murder, he could also be tried by the criminal system and then punished because he broke the law. So his position doesn't shelter him from those sorts of laws. So the second part of our government, the Congress that we formed, was somewhat similar to the government of England. So in England, they had the House of Lords, and this was a hereditary position in the government. So you assumed the position because of the family that you were in. And as it sounds like, it was the lords of the country. So they're kind of the under government under the king. So the king was over everything. The lords were over their part of the land. They set the laws for those underneath them. They interacted with each other. So as that grew up, as the commoners started to push back against that, the House of Lords remained intact as a body that looked out for the interests of the aristocracy. Now, that's always sounds bad, and in some senses it is, but it also needs to be remembered that they were the majority landholders. They were the ones that were in charge of the resources. So they needed to have a strong representation in government in order to protect those resources from the abuse of those who are just consuming them. So we got rid of that when it came to the United States. We have a Senate that's not hereditary. They're not put in place because they own territory of any sort, but they're put in place, well, originally they were put in place by the states because they were to represent the states. So that's that geographic resource representation that helps bring balance to that government. We've since done away with that thanks to our amending the Constitution. I would definitely say that's detrimental to us because the states no longer have representation in the U.S. government anymore. And the other portion of the Congress is the representatives. So in England, that would be the House of Commons. And originally that grew up because the common people, those who didn't have titles, those who weren't part of the aristocracy, were tired of getting abused. So they pushed back until they were able to get a voice in the government. So it helps balance out the government. You have the views of the everyday, and then you have the views of those who have the resources, who have control over portions of land, things like that. And they were to balance each other out. So the House of Lords, you have people who are well-trained, well-educated. You have a lot of ability that's brought in there, as well as a lot of money. So they were not put out by having to spend a lot of time on government affairs. Then you have the House of Commons, where very quickly people were getting elected in and out. They represented the everyday people, so they often voted with the people, whichever way the winds blew. So when the founders were creating our government, they were very cautious about any type of democracy being introduced into our government. The downside with democracy that they were warning everybody about and were guarding against is what they called the passions of the people. So they would suggest that designing men, they called them, could stir up the passions of the people to get them to vote whatever way they wanted in order so that these designing men could control and abuse everybody that they needed to. So in order to put a check on that, the House of Representatives in the United States only has limited authority. So everything always has to get balanced back and forth. So the states in the Senate had a check against the passions of the people. The passions of the people were guarded by constantly changing out our representatives. Every 2 years, they can be voted out and a new one could be voted in. So the winds are blowing one way, an election comes, and suddenly there's a check on that. Or people get all stirred up about one thing, and before they actually get any laws passed, it's the next election cycle. So there's a little bit of a check there from the Senate to the House and from the House to the Senate. So again, we're very concerned about aristocracies in this country. We prevented the hereditary titles to the Senate. It's set up so that the Senate can't run off and do things by themselves. Everything gets balanced out by the executive or by the House of Commons. So we see checks on the government between the two branches of the Congress and the executive. When it comes to rule of law, the founders discussed what happens if the Congress creates laws that violate the Constitution. So they discussed 3 checks on such things. The first check was the Congress itself. They intended that to be filled by folks who had some education on governments of any type, not necessarily classical educations, but had experience in government, had an understanding of business, understanding of economics, that sort of thing. And they intended everybody to take an oath to support and uphold the Constitution. And if they didn't know the Constitution, that oath was pretty useless. So they intended these folks to be educated enough to be able to make intelligent laws and intelligent decisions. So the first check on constitutional violation, on the violation of our natural rights, is the Congress itself. Now, if the Congress failed to do their own job, if they passed laws that were in violation of the Constitution, if they passed laws that were tyrannical and oppressed people's natural rights, the next check was to be the state government. Or in cases of the states, the next check is then to be your local governments, your county, your towns, your cities. They are to stand between the tyrannical central government and your local population. Once upon a time, we used to have militias in this country. The federal government could not force things on ordinary citizens because the state militias or the local militias could come out in force and drive them off or tar and feather them and ride them out of town on a rail. We've since surrendered our militias, so we no longer have that protection. But if the state government is properly in place, properly understanding their authority, they can prevent federal agents, federal government from coming in and harming the citizens of that state. So that was the second protection against unjust laws, against unconstitutional laws. The third and last protection was the people. Now, the people, again, used to compose the militia, so that was a very easy protection. Everybody around you was part of the militia. If somebody came in and tried to abuse your rights, all of your neighbors would show up with their guns and push back. So we don't have a militia anymore. We probably should be working on putting one together, but that's more of a long-term solution at this point. Another check that the people have is being juries. During the revolution, the king kept creating more and more oppressive laws, the king and parliament. And these laws would abuse people, would take their money through taxes, take their property through taxes, and the citizens who were sitting on juries understood the law well. So if a case came up before them and it was an obvious tyrannical move by the king or the parliament, they could simply find not guilty and let the person go free. And if it was something where the person was actually guilty of a crime, they stole, they hurt somebody, but the laws were overly oppressive, the juries could find for a lesser crime or for a lighter sentence than what was recommended by the king or the parliament or the judges. And in this way, they could bring about justice. They wouldn't just let people go who were committing crimes, but they were allowing people to go free that weren't committing crimes and where tyranny was coming in. So juries were very key at that time. It got so annoying to the king that he started to move away from jury trials, and he had courts of admiralty taking over all these cases where there was no jury, where it was far away from where the person lived. Often they would get taken way off, and they couldn't present witnesses at their own defense because it was a far distance. And we see in the Declaration of Independence of the 13 colonies that that was one of the abuses that they were pushing back against. So the people can be a check in those ways. They can also be a check by assembling together and petitioning the government for redress of grievances, as they called it. So that's a constitutionally protected right, but that's a natural right. The government gets its authority by the consent of the people. If the people don't consent, the government is no longer legitimate in the actions it's taking. So if we have rallies, if we have people that go to the government body while they're in session to speak to them, to petition, that's the ultimate check on government. And if the government doesn't listen, back in the day, they had a lot of more hands-on approaches to it. Governor of Massachusetts, the judges of Massachusetts were in fear for their lives when they fled Massachusetts back to the king because the people had enough of it. Preferably, we don't do that these days. You can vote them out. You can have them removed through an impeachment, through a recall. There's a lot of ways to deal with that now in a more nonviolent manner. So we have rule of law. We have just law and unjust law, tyranny. And then we have the different checks against that. One of the biggest reasons juries have gone away is because the government was unable to control in those situations. So if you have a jury trial now, you'll get a jury instruction, and those instructions pretty much tell you you have to do what the judge tells you to do. You have to find however the judge tells you to find. It doesn't get said that way, but that's the impression that is generally left. And rarely do juries ever push back against that. They don't say that this law is abuse. They don't say that the way the police handled the situation was abuse. They pretty much do whatever they're told to do. So we've surrendered our military, our militia. We've surrendered our right to jury trials and that protection. And oftentimes we see a surrender of our right to petition. So we allow governing bodies to keep people out. So you'll have a rally, and then you'll have the governor's people come out, his troops, his police come out and push the people back. You'll have a rally and people will come to the state house and demand to be let in to hear what their representatives are doing, and they'll be barred from coming in. So we don't really have rule of law anymore in this country. We don't have just laws. We have a lot of tyranny in the laws. And we have those laws applied however the government deems fit. We have a lot of executive orders coming around. We have a lot of laws that apply to certain people but not to others. So when you hear the term rule of law being used, take a minute and think about it. Is it really rule of law, or is it abuse of power? And again, as always, I recommend everybody take some time, read about the American Revolution, read the writings of the founders, and see what the common sense of the patriot is. All right, thank you.